All right. So, we just right now concluded, of course, winter, at least for meteorologists. I don't know if you guys know this, but meteorological seasons are different from astronomical seasons by about 3 weeks. So meteorological winter is December, January, and February. And for Miami, we just had our second hottest winter in history, and 8 of the hottest winters have all occurred in the last 16 years, even though Miami's records date back to 1896. So February's temperature was 5.2 degrees hotter than normal in Miami, and overall since 1970, we are 6 degrees warmer today in February than we were in that year, 53 years ago. Now, I bring all this up talking about winter. When it's warmer in winter, some people like it, some people don't like it. Certainly Florida winters is something that a lot of people up north aspire to be able to enjoy, right? And we've got them here all the time. But when temperatures are 6 degrees hotter today than they were in 1970, and then you move forward in the calendar and you get to July and August, then that makes pardon my language, hell of a difference, right? Because in summertime, when you have temperatures that instead of staying at 89 or 90, or maybe 91, are reaching 94, 95, and 96, and then you add to that the humidity that we typically feel here in Florida, that means that the heat index, or the feels-like temperature, ends up being 105, 108, 110, and it starts to become dangerous. And it's not just dangerous for folks that are working outside in construction or in agriculture. It becomes dangerous for people staying at home, people who find it challenging to think of turning on their AC because it's a choice between putting food on the table or paying the rent, or paying Florida Power and Light and their increasing rates today, right? So this next panel is going to address just that: heat and health, and the increasing risk that we're seeing from the silent killer, which, in case you didn't know, is heat, because heat is the #1 weather-related fatality in this country and around the world. More than floods, more than hurricanes, more than tornadoes. So think of that as we head into this panel. This panel is titled "The Scorching Reality, the Health Impacts of Climate Change and Extreme Heat," and it will discuss the health impacts of climate change with a focus on the effects of extreme heat. Plus, it will address the importance of taking action to mitigate the mental and physical health impacts of climate change, and share the panelists' perspective on the role of local and federal policy in reducing climate-related health hazards. During the panel, you'll be able to gain valuable insights and knowledge from these renowned experts and learn how we can work together or towards protecting our personal health and build more resilient and sustainable communities. So for this purpose, 3 panelists are going to be coming up. One is a colleague, Bonnie Schneider, meteorologist and author for Simon & Schuster. Martin Derrow from the Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, and Shauna Junco from Orlando Health. She is a clinical pharmacist. Bonnie, Martin, and Shauna up on stage right now.
I'm meteorologist and author Bonnie Schneider, and I want to tell you about my new book, Taking the Heat: How Climate Change is Affecting Your Mind, Body, and Spirit, and what you can do about it. For over the past 2 decades, I've been reporting on all types of extreme weather, from hurricanes to wildfires, severe storms to floods. Many of these events are happening more often and with greater frequency due to climate change. In researching and writing this book, the doctors and medical professionals I interviewed say that climate change is impacting their patients' health right now. In this book, I speak to young people about their fears for the future of this planet. Psychologists say these are very real concerns and offer coping tips in taking the heat. Plus, learn ways to talk to young children about their fears of climate change. This book examines the science behind why connecting with our natural environment, practicing gratitude and mindful meditation can help enhance our overall mental well-being. Taking the Heat will help you navigate and proactively face these challenges in our changing environment.
Thank you for watching that. So I am so pleased to be here in Florida. I'm a recent transplant from New York, like many people. This past year, I just moved to Florida, and I'm happy to be a Floridian. And joining me now on this panel are two esteemed experts. I'm so pleased to welcome them. First, we have Shauna Junco, who is a clinical pharmacist specializing in infectious disease, and Dr. Martin Derrow, retired internal medicine doctor, and they are both members of the Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. Please give them a round of applause. So we're going to dig right into this topic of how climate change affects health and wellness. As you saw, I recently wrote a book on this topic, and climate change not only affects our physical health, but also affects mental health, and that is why we're going to be discussing both areas in this panel. For the first question, I wanted to go to Dr. Derrow to talk about extreme heat. We heard from John Morales about how heat is the leading killer. It kills more than any other weather scenario that we experience. But how does extreme heat affect individuals that have pre-existing conditions like cardiovascular disease, respiratory problems, or kidney disease?
I mean, let's start with cardiovascular disease. Extreme heat puts a much greater stress on the heart. The heart has to work much harder just to maintain the body's temperature at an acceptable range. So extreme heat events are associated with an increase in all-cause hospitalizations, an increase in cardiovascular complications, including worsening hypertension or high blood pressure, an increased risk of stroke, heart attack, heart failure, and rhythm disturbances of the heart. Also, we prescribe medications, important life-saving medications, such as drugs like beta blockers or certain calcium channel blockers. And these drugs, which are life-saving medications for our patients, also slow the heartbeat down, and that can be a good thing, but it may impair the heart's ability to cope with extreme heat. We also prescribe water pills, diuretics, for patients with heart failure and patients with hypertension or high blood pressure and some other conditions as well. And again, these are beneficial medications, but in extreme heat can deplete the body of salt and water and complicate an individual's ability to cope with the extreme heat. When we're talking about kidney disease, people who have pre-existing kidney disease are harmed by extreme heat. They tend to get worse. And even people who may have normal kidney function to start with, when exposed to repeated extreme heat events, may develop heat-related kidney disease, which can progress over time. In addition, there's an increased incidence of kidney stones, in extreme heat events. And I have to point out that when you're talking about cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, we really need to mention our diabetic patients, because the diabetic population, which is huge, is much more likely to suffer from concomitant cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, and may be even less able to adjust to the increased temperature. Lung disease is impacted directly by extreme heat and also by air pollution, which often accompanies extreme heat, right? So wildfire-induced particulate matter, which can drift over from the West Coast here. And I saw in today's weather report, actually, that we are currently in a high-risk situation here in Central Florida for wildfires. So we have our own homegrown wildfires as well. People who have underlying lung disease, including people with chronic obstructive lung disease, emphysema, interstitial lung disease, and our asthmatic patients are all worsened by extreme heat and poor air quality.
Yeah, it really does affect many people in different ways, and we're talking about how people are affected, but it's also the medicines, as you mentioned, Dr. Derrow, that people are on. So Shauna, my question to you is, when we're facing more days with extreme heat, these certain types of medications can degrade. So I'd like you to explain the connection between extreme heat, excessive heat, and medications, and how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? What steps can people take?
Sure. So You know, we're all familiar with when you cook an egg, the egg whites go from clear to white. The composition of the egg changes because the chemical structure is changing molecularly due to that extreme heat exposure. And the same thing is true for a lot of medications. So when medications are developed, when they're studied under very tight temperature controls. So for a lot of medications, we actually don't have information on what happens when they're exposed above really 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So we have to assume that a lot of them, if they're on an excursion above 85 degrees for any length of time, they may become unstable. There's some data in looking at real-world exposure of emergency rescue medications. So recently there was a study published actually by the National Park Service looking at this, and they found that atropine, which is a drug that the park rangers carry with them for medical emergencies when someone's heart rate is so slow that they're not adequately oxygenating the tissue in their bodies because their heart is not pumping the blood well enough. So this drug, atropine, speeds up the heart rate. And they found out that just after 4 weeks of exposure to normal temperatures, it was completely undetectable.
Wow.
Another drug that is really concerning is epinephrine, because you have to have that with you at all times. There was a study that showed if you left that in conditions similar to the trunk of your car for 5 days, the degradation is substantial. So I think that there's kind of 2 takeaway points going forward. One is we actually don't have this data for a lot of medications, so that's something we're going to need to really pay more attention to as we have hotter and hotter temperatures. The drugs will be exposed to hotter temperatures, especially for people's home medications. If people lose access to air conditioning and power loss situations, or if they don't have air conditioning in their homes. But also just, education about how to take care of those medications. So if the medication's composition has obviously changed, that happens a lot with liquid antibiotics, for example, those medications shouldn't be taken. And then for emergency drugs like insulin or epinephrine, if you carry those with you, they really need to be on a cool pack. Never leave medications in the trunk of your car. If you're traveling, you really need to have them with you to make sure they're never exposed to extreme heat.
That's such a great point. I was just thinking that I have an EpiPen, I have a bee allergy, and I've probably done that, left it in a warm place. So that's excellent advice to make sure that our medications stay vital, that we need to have them in the event of an emergency. I wanted to talk a little also about mental health. In my book, Taking the Heat, I devoted 5 chapters specifically to mental health. And I'm wondering, just in this room, how many of you heard the term eco-anxiety before? So that's a pretty good number. Across the country, a lot of people find it to be a relatively new term, but it really means that fear of climate change itself. And in the research that I did for the book, it was overwhelming that Gen Z, ages, let's say, 18 to 23, those are some of the people I interviewed for the book, this was a major, major concern for young people and how they're coping with their feelings about climate change, and it can lead to anxiety and other mental health issues. That's one area that climate change affects mental health. Another is exposure to disasters. We're seeing more frequent extreme weather events due to climate change. And imagine if you live in a place that gets these events happening over and over, like in California, let's say, you're in one town that's getting wildfire, they're happening repeatedly every season, and they're lasting longer, and they're more destructive. Those types of events trigger anxiety as well, and also having to relocate or be displaced due to a storm. So taking that all together with some of these mental health aspects, I wanted to ask Dr. Derrow, in your experience, what else are you finding when it comes to mental health and climate change when we're drawing the connections and the significant threats for danger that we may face ahead?
So first of all, the risk for mental health complications is even more closely felt by children and by low-income communities. And I know this was just brought up in the last panel. I just want to add my voice to this whole issue of energy equity and the disproportionate impact of climate change on communities of color as well as low-income communities. That's got to be central to anything we do. Well, I know you talk in your book, Bonnie, about dealing with eco-anxiety, and I think from what I've read, one of the things that people can do is to acknowledge it, to think about what they can control and what they cannot control, and to perhaps be more involved, be proactive, be part of the solution, in addressing climate change. But mental health, the broader picture of mental health, is a huge part of the health impact of climate change. Heat-related events, for example, are associated with worsening mental illness in people who have pre-existing mental illness. There are increases in substance abuse, suicide, PTSD, and obviously that's quite significant. There's an increase in hostility and aggression during extreme heat, and all of those things, need to be addressed. And there's also the issue that pre-existing mental illness is an important marker for mortality in heat events. And in fact, people with pre-existing mental illness are 3 times more likely to die in an extreme heat event. So it's a major, major public health problem. And I think part of the problem is that our ability to provide mental health services across the board is not able to meet the demand. And it hasn't for some time, and I think we saw that during the pandemic as well, where major mental health needs were kind of unmet largely throughout the country. And again, those areas most impacted are the same areas we're talking about, in particular of less well-developed and economically disadvantaged communities.
And that's a good point. I mean, the most vulnerable people are the ones that are affected the worst in these extreme heat waves. And we're seeing these days where we're getting hotter temperatures that are lasting longer. The summer seems to be coming earlier. So more people are affected. Another aspect of climate change and health is something that I'm sure many of you also have heard and read more about, different types of viruses and bacteria and fungi and things that can infect us. And there's the rapid spread of this due to warmer temperatures. And in my book, I wrote about different diseases that are being felt, let's say, at more northern latitudes than they had in the past. So one of the concerns is when we're getting these dangerous threats to our health is, well, do we have medicines that can fight the virus, and antibiotics, something that would work to fight against something? But some of these situations can be where it's antibiotic resistant and we're not able to come up with a quick solution. So this is a concern going forward, and I'm wondering, Shauna, how you see warmer temperatures globally affecting these strains of resistance from antibiotics.
Well, it's a really interesting question, and there are so many fascinating connections between infectious diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change. So you may not all know what infectious disease pharmacists do, but I've devoted my career to trying to reduce antimicrobial resistance throughout my health system in Central Florida, as well as really globally by publishing on resistant organisms and treatment options for them. So back to the question, how are they related? Well, when you think about severe weather events like floods, those cause waterborne diseases. In hotter weather, we see more cellulitis. We also actually see more severe infections going back to extreme heat. Pneumonia isn't something you may think about as being affected by extreme heat, but if you're someone who's healthy and has a mild pneumonia that's responded to oral antibiotics at home and you lose access to your air conditioning during a heat wave, you're very likely going to need to get treatment in a hospital. So it places an enormous stress on our health system, but also we're treating more infections. So one of the ways that I try to reduce antimicrobial resistance in my health system is by reducing inappropriate treatment with antibiotics. So when we realize somebody doesn't need to be on antibiotics because we've ruled out an infection, making sure we stop the antibiotics. Stopping the antibiotics after an effective duration has been used. Because the longer bacteria are exposed to an antibiotic, the more likely they are to develop resistance. So just seeing increases in infections in general, we're going to be using more antibiotics. There's also going to be changes in vector-borne illnesses. We've already seen that in Florida. We're seeing a huge increase in infections caused by mosquitoes and ticks in this area. So again, using more antibiotics, seeing more antimicrobial resistance. And there also seems potentially to be a direct connection in the literature with heat. So there was a study done in Europe that looked at a 6-year period across 30 countries, and they saw that for every half a degree increase, degree Celsius, there was a one-fold increase in what is arguably the worst bacteria from an antimicrobial resistance standpoint, which is Pseudomonas aeruginosa, that's resistant to really our broadest class of antibiotics, or what has been our broadest class of antibiotics for a very long time, which is the carbapenems. So a one-fold increase for a 0.5 degree Celsius increase in that area. So it's very concerning, and also just the amount of antibiotics that we're using outside of health systems in agriculture is likely contributing to this, because where is it ending up? First of all, it's affecting the bacteria in the animals, which we're eating animal products and eating the animals, so we're ingesting those resistant bacteria. And additionally, it's ending up in the environment, and it's exposing all of the microbes that occur naturally in the environment to very low doses of antibiotics chronically. And some of those antibiotics really don't degrade in those situations, so they can persist for years. So we have to really be thinking about not just reducing antimicrobial use in our hospitals, which is a mandated, it's mandated that hospitals have antimicrobial stewardship programs now. We need to be thinking, why are we using this in agriculture? Why are we using this in a way that's getting into our environment, and thinking about, you know, the whole life cycle of the antibiotic, not ending at human consumption, but where does it really end?
That's a great point. And unfortunately, with the warmer temperatures, we're just facing a greater exposure to these vector-borne diseases or waterborne illness and viruses like that. So that's something to be concerned with as well. Shifting gears a little bit to women that are trying to get pregnant, that are having children. I think most people know that heat waves and excessive heat would be uncomfortable for a woman who's pregnant, but there's serious health concerns. And Dr. Derrow, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So pregnant people exposed to extreme heat, particularly in the second and third trimesters of pregnancy or the last 6 months of pregnancy, are more likely to give birth to underweight children, to have premature birth, and they have a higher incidence of stillborn children as well. For exposure to air pollution during either in utero or in childhood is associated with an increased risk of autism spectrum disorder, as well as PTSD, a reduced IQ, and impaired neurologic development. And these are permanent and have an impact for the rest of the life of this individual. And you know, the pregnant woman, pregnant individual themselves, you know, are at increased risk as well. They have a higher likelihood of preeclampsia, which could be a life-threatening complication of pregnancy, as well as hypertension, and they're at more risk of heat exhaustion and heat stroke.
And I guess they have to be more aware of those signs of when they're feeling uncomfortable with heat. It's something to take seriously and seek in a cooler spot as soon as possible. Well, Shauna, we talked a little bit about medications that can degrade over time with heat, but there's another factor I think that came into play that we heard a lot about during the pandemic, and that is the supply chain disruptions that can happen. So considering that may be another factor going forward with the threat of climate change, what is it that we need to be concerned with how medications are affected by supply chain disruptions and keeping those medications stable?
Yeah, so we experienced this throughout the United States after Hurricane Maria. So a lot of people may not realize, but when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, most of the island had no power because they had just been pummeled by 2 really big storms already. I'm sure you know
I know, I was just thinking,
that.
I remember reporting that, yeah.
So, I mean, the island was just devastated when Hurricane Maria hit because it was more rainfall than they had ever seen when they already had no power. And most people don't know this either, but at the time, Puerto Rico was the major supplier of intravenous fluids to the United States and multiple other countries. So when it couldn't make intravenous fluids for months and months and months, hospitals didn't have enough intravenous fluids to supply to their patients. And actually, most intravenous antibiotics are not given by IV push. They're mostly given in an IV fluid bag. So it had a huge impact on my specialty because we had to figure out how could we reserve intravenous fluids for people who were coming in with dehydration and heat stroke. You know, it was the middle of the summer. And we treat those diseases all the time, and they can be life-threatening if you don't have fluids to give to people. So it was a huge impact on my specialty. So I think one thing that's good, I guess, is that clinical pharmacists for a long time now have been dealing with drug shortages, so we're able to figure out when they come, but trying to figure out how we can predict these a little bit better. And when they do happen, implementing them into our guidelines. So for example, with the intravenous fluid shortage, one of the ways that we give intravenous antibiotics, now certain intravenous antibiotics, is continuously, 24 hours a day, and that is easier to give in a bag, but isn't always necessary. So in our guidelines, we now give them in fluid still, but we have a line in the event of a shortage, this medication can be given IV push. So we can make rapid changes if that were to happen again.
You know, it's interesting to go through these, the worst of times, but then at least we gain some insight, you know, for the next, hopefully we won't have another one, but I didn't know that about, that was some of the takeaways from Maria, that devastating storm. Dr. Derrow, we sort of touched a little bit into diabetes. I want to just mention it further because I thought it was interesting that in Florida, approximately, this is according to the American Diabetes Association, approximately 2.5% of Florida's adult population is diabetic. They've been diagnosed with diabetes, but there's another 500,000 people in this state that have diabetes and don't even know it. So this is a big concern for Florida, and as we're already in such a warm place, its temperatures continue to rise. What are some of the concerns you have in terms of the medical threat that we're facing for diabetics specifically, and people that might find themselves to be diagnosed in the future?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, so diabetes is such a high risk for associated cardiovascular disease that we actually assume that our patients with diabetes may have cardiovascular disease, and we treat them preventively to try to keep something bad from happening, such as reducing the risk of a heart attack. So it's a few things. The diabetes can affect pretty much every part of your body. So it increases the likelihood of kidney disease, of cardiovascular disease, peripheral vascular disease, eye disease, and obviously those are all very serious problems. It also makes it harder because of that, of the neurologic abnormalities, vascular abnormalities. These folks are less able to cope with extreme heat. At the same time, kind of to Shauna's point, they have medications they have to have, and some medications, insulin for example, have very tight tolerances for what they are able to stand in terms of heat exposure, and for that matter, just the supply chain. In extreme weather events, they may not be able to get their medication, and for them, these are life-threatening situations. So it complicates everything.
Is that, Shauna, something that you've noticed too, when there's a greater demand for a certain medication, and then there's the compounding effect of heat that just escalates the reason maybe to get messaging out better and things like that?
Oh, I think we have to do a better job messaging about heat-related illness. As mentioned multiple times, it's the silent killer, and especially in places like Florida where we don't really think of heat as a big deal. We need to really be educating people. No, there's heat that's coming that you will not, you will have to take dramatic action and really, really be safe. And especially in the event of a power shortage, you need to have a plan. But I would say, just adding on to what Dr. Derrow said about diabetes, studies have come out that show that particulate matter explains 15% of diabetes cases. I mean, that makes me so angry. And when you think about other causes of diabetes, what's the main cause of diabetes is the nutrition in this country. Why are we eating the foods we're eating? It's because of what's in our farm bill, and that makes me angry. There's real solutions that are health solutions. So I think that's one thing that we really need to elevate is in the discussion of climate change is pollution and these extreme weather events and just the average temperature going up is really having a dramatic effect on human health today. Exactly. Your kids, you. Yes, it affects vulnerable populations a lot more, and we need to really focus on them when we come up with solutions, but everyone is being affected by this. And we have solutions. We know what they are, and they're health solutions.
And one of the main things about heat heat-related illness is that it's preventable. It's something that is preventable if the messaging is out there. And when I was writing Taking the Heat, I spoke to so many medical professionals that were just as adamant as both of you are about how serious this is, but they said that they found their patients, most of them were not as aware. They even had some surveys like that where the doctors were, the patients aren't. So going forward as we wrap this up, if both of you could just give a few words of what you'd like to see happen solution-wise to this issue. Dr. Derrow, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, I think speaking from a background of a practicing physician, I spent my career advocating for and caring for patients one at a time, and later in my career was quite involved in population health initiatives and doing the same thing for communities, such as the Central Florida community. I think we have to stand up, speak out, and advocate. This is, climate change is the greatest health threat that we face today, and is likely to be for the foreseeable future.
That's a good point. Shauna?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, climate solutions are health solutions. Almost any climate solution you look at has dramatic health effects that are positive. So just like climate change is causing a lot of terrible things for health, we have the solutions and they're great for health. So we really need to elevate the message that these solutions are not just affordable, but at a point where they save us money, they can improve our resiliency. You know, there was a slide about bidirectional charging. That can be a huge backup source of energy during emergencies when we have power loss. I mean, one of the worst things about extreme heat waves is that we lose power because the utilities cannot keep up. So we need to think, you know, how can we improve resiliency of our energy, and how can we improve our resiliency of our backup energy through green methods? And there's so many amazing solutions out there that have just a ripple effect on health. And so those are the solutions that I'm focusing on.
Thank you both so much. This was a really enlightening conversation, and I'm glad that we ended it on a positive note of what we can do going forward solution-wise. And I thank you both so much for joining me on this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for watching.